Hello everyone, back again with me Dia Setiawati from Rumah Pemilu. Here I'm with Michael Mc.Nulty. He's a senior program manager election in NDI, National Democratic Institute. How are you, Michael?
Doing well, enjoying the forum, and congratulations to Preludum for doing good work to help contribute to this event.
Thank you so much. So, could you please tell us about the thing you do, especially related to open parliament data in your current projects, and perhaps the updates about it?
Sure. Well, NDI works in a number of areas to help advance democracy, and what I particularly work on and the team I work on are working with civil society groups like Preludum around the world to advance electoral integrity. So that includes things like election observation, electoral reform advocacy, all the way over to pushing for reducing barriers to marginalized populations in the election process. But NDI does work far beyond that. We work with political parties, parliaments, women political leaders, and others to improve and strengthen the democratic institutions and to make sure that citizens have a voice in holding their governments accountable. So that's the general gist of what we do. But within the elections team, one of our big initiatives has been focused on working with civil society groups to promote open data, and particularly open election data. So I'd be happy to talk more about that if you're interested.
What do you mean about open election data? And I heard that you also have some principles about that. Could you please explain to us?
Sure. So what we mean by open election data is, first, we're not talking about just numbers. We're talking about every part of the process of elections, including, for example, decisions that are made about how people are appointed to be commissioners, to the legal framework, to election results data, which is more numbers, and to the electoral dispute resolution. So any part of the process we're calling election data, right? And the other principle that rests behind that is that because elections belong to the people, they don't belong to the election commission, they don't belong to the politician or the candidate, they belong to the people and the voters. So what that implies is that election data belongs to the voters and the people. So in order to make it belong to them, they need to have access to it, and they need to be able to see it. Civil society groups need to be able to look at those decisions, the data, analyze it, and help the voters understand whether they can truly trust this election process. And ultimately, that's how we feel elections can be deemed credible or not, whether or not the voters themselves actually trust the process. So open election data to us means a lot more than just transparency. It means accountability, because people can use the data to hold people accountable. It also means inclusiveness, because it means everyone can have the information they need to participate. And then ultimately that leads to trust. And so when we talk about the principles of open election data, what we try to look at are, the global norms that have developed over the years around open data in general, open government data in general. They're very well accepted, very well known. Many governments around the world have signed on to commitments, OGP commitments, and other things. So what we've done is taken those principles and apply them to the electoral arena. And there's 9 on openelectiondata.net. We've outlined them. We have a guide that outlines what we mean by these principles. But just to mention a few that we think are very important. Number 1, election data should be provided in a timely way. So, for example, here in Indonesia, I understand the protocols for election results, the image files, the scans, are released very quickly. If they didn't release those until 2 weeks after the election here, people would be very upset. There would be uncertainty. No one would be able to verify whether they can trust. And so that's what we mean by timely, that any information needs to be released when it matters in the political process. And another principle that we think is very important is granularity, which means you can't just provide summary information like the total national level results or the total number of voters that are registered, but instead you need to provide, the election commission needs to provide it down to the lowest level possible. So in the case of election results, polling station level. In the case of the voters list, the actual voters themselves. And what that does is actually allow people to have some meaningful analysis of this information, campaign finance data, down to the expenditure level as opposed to overall summaries of what each candidate spent. So we can talk more about the other 7 principles, but those are just 2 I wanted to give examples of what we mean.
Okay, so the website is openelectiondata.net. Yeah.
Yep, exactly.
And then you mentioned that this is taken from several protocols that already ratified or agreed around the world, like OGP and stuff. But do these open election data principles also already agreed by some countries, perhaps?
It's a great question. So we are now working with organizations both at the national level, like civil society groups like Proludem and other observer groups, as well as with electoral management bodies and organizations that provide technical assistance to election management bodies to advance these principles, to generate consensus around these principles. And we've been fairly successful over the last few years in holding some global dialogues on this. So in Mexico City in 2014, we worked with the Election Commission there to organize a global dialogue between election commissioners and election observers, very similar to the Asian Electoral Stakeholders Forum model. It was actually inspired by the Bangkok Declaration. And so through these dialogues, we've been able to advance consensus around what are, well, first of all, that it's important, and second of all, what are the principles. We've also, that's the global level, and there's also the regional level. If you look at the Asian Electoral Stakeholder Bali commitments, you will find many of those principles embedded in the commitments. And then at the national level, we work through the global network of domestic election monitors and regional observer networks, member organizations that are essentially local civil society groups that observe elections, to help them advocate in their country to make sure that these principles end up in the laws and in the electoral procedures and in the way that the election commissions behave, as well as the parties, the way they behave. So it's really not something you can say every country has signed on and that's the end. It's a process, and we have to keep pushing and advancing these things into practice.
So Proludem actually also maintain the open data initiative and also the environment, and we also try to promote the principles to the election commission itself. But as you can see in Indonesia or in most countries in Asia, information, data and information, sometimes the access to it's some kind like privilege somehow. How do you see this, or how do you see the growing trends perhaps across Asia or over the world? Will this be something that will be taken seriously, and perhaps one day it will be done by default?
That's a great question, because that is the end goal. The trend overall, there's clear momentum to providing open data and open election data around the world. Now, there's a lot of countries still that have more closed tendencies, maybe more authoritarian tendencies, that are very reluctant to provide open election data, or they only provide certain types of data that really aren't that important and then withhold other data that actually are important. But the overall trend is absolutely towards providing open election data, whether it be making sure voters can understand, where their polling station is, to civil society groups having access to the voters list, to providing the electoral complaints so people can analyze the decisions around the complaints. So yes, the trend is towards that, but there are big challenges, and one of the challenges you raised was limited access or only privileged access. And that's one of the principles as well, which is free, available freely, which implies not only without cost, but also that it's discoverable in a way. So it's easy to find, it's easy to access for people. They don't have to find the secret link on a website somewhere that's buried to find that data, but it's very easy for them. So what the trade-offs are around that are, like, the default in a lot of places, more and more so, is to make it free and make it online and make it available. But there's certain concerns with some of the data, like campaign finance data, like the voters list, that there might be privacy concerns. And so in those cases, if maybe there's a privacy law in a country that forbids the election commission from releasing the full voters list down to very granular level. What one consideration that some countries have worked out is that trusted actors who are directly involved in the political and electoral process can get access to the list, so that it's not made available to everyone, but for parties who are competing, for civil society groups who are accredited to observe, and those trusted actors can take the list, analyze it, and then interpret it for the voters so that they can decide whether they can trust the list or not. So that's one way to get around some of the limitations of access.
I would also like to raise two critical issues. First of all, the digital divide, like one participant from Africa yesterday mentions. How about if we don't have electricity or internet connection, because the open data initiatives are really related to the technology. Second of all, my question is about the disbursement of the open data itself, because we see trends that we are very high in terms of enthusiasm to open the data, but a lot of them after it complaints, especially for the election management bodies. We already open all of our data, but what does it mean? Do people really use our data? That we don't get any response from citizens. So because the data is just data without the use of it to citizens. So how to leverage the impact of open data itself?
Those are two very good points. They're somewhat related. So the first point about the digital divide, there's a tendency, because a lot of the people who work on open government and open election data tend to be people who also tend to lean towards technology and think of technological solutions and think of everything being online. So that's a bias in the groupings around open data, but that is one side of the coin, and certainly the people who are civil society groups and parties tend to sort of get their data through that means. But you also raised a good point that in many countries, people don't have online access, they don't have smartphones, they may not even have regular mobile phones. So for those people, it's incumbent upon civil society and election commissions to leverage the open election data that is relevant for those people in those areas and make sure that they get information. And really that's about voter education, that's about taking into account the country context, making sure that the people who need the information most, who are the ones furthest away in the rural areas, the more disconnected people, get information that they need on how to vote, where to vote, when to vote, and also how to make an informed choice around elections and how to decide whether they can trust the elections. So those people may not need every single piece of election data. Only certain pieces are relevant for those actors, but it takes a huge effort on civil society's part and the election commission's part and the party's part to make sure that they get access to the data they need in the right way they can consume it. One solution, obviously, that in many countries is taking shape as people get more mobile phones is, provision of information through SMS, for example. It's not that high technology, it's a simple system, but getting access to where to vote and information about the candidates, checking your name on the register and other things through simple SMS. It's not very high tech, but it's a way to get access to an open data. To the second point, how to leverage open data. This is something that's been discussed certainly in the last few years among the open data community, that this move from transparency to accountability. How do you transition from providing information to actually equipping people to use it in the right way? So one thing that needs a lot of focus is training for groups in the electoral arena, for example, on how do you analyze election data and then leverage it in your election observation or in your electoral reform advocacy. Or, for example, groups that might focus on a particular theme or issue or subgroup, like a women's rights group. How does election data relate to them? For example, well, if they can get access to the voter registration rates and voters list at very fine-grained levels, they can quickly see where there are disparities in the registration rates among men and women, and then they can more effectively target their campaigns to register women in those areas where women are under-registered. So these are things that they take time to develop over time, and groups oftentimes don't see the immediate connection. So it's incumbent on civil society groups, on the open data community, on the election commissions to not only just provide passively the information, but to equip the actors who can use the information to be able to use it effectively and to target it in a strategic way. And then also, as part of that, one thing we've developed on our openelectiondata.net, our Open Election Data Initiative, is something called the Data Academy. And so on this part of the site, you can actually download training modules on different ways to analyze election data so that civil society groups who are interested can learn how do you do more with the data and how do you move from transparency to accountability. I think other sectors of open data have also started to do these similar models, and I think that's a good step to helping address that.
Okay, thank you very much. It's really interesting because about the Data Academy especially, because the digital divide is not only happens in the public level, but also in the election management body itself, because here in Indonesia we have almost 400,000 personnel, and there's a lot of digital divide, because when you talk about open data, you have to also equip them with the infrastructure, at least the basic knowledge about it, and how to have a good or the best data infrastructure, for example. And so you mentioned about how the party should also involve. Could you please elaborate about it? And also, we also talk about the inclusivity of the election should be. So there's some marginals or some person with disabilities or women women's sector, for instance, that still somehow left behind in these election sectors. How open data could help them?
That's a great question. So about the political parties and their role, if you look at the different parts of the electoral process and the different types of data that are available in those different parts of the process, you can see entry points for parties in pretty much all those points in the process. So for example, for voter registration information, they can also use that to better target their supporters in certain areas and understand where they need to make sure that their supporters are being registered. For electoral dispute resolution and electoral complaints, if a party is saying or feels that their complaints are not being resolved in a fair way, but they don't actually look at the data and push to get access to the data to analyze it and provide evidence, well then that's not really a way to prove a case. So parties need to be able to push for the data, get it, analyze it, and then use it as evidence to back up their claims. And oftentimes we see political parties not do that and make claims based on maybe baseless information or rumors or other things, and then it creates instability in the electoral process without having actual evidence. Another part of the process that they truly need to be contributing to is the campaign finance area, because in a lot of countries there might be laws that require campaign income or campaign expenditure disclosures and limits, but we see parties not holding themselves accountable to do that. And we also see the commissions responsible for holding them accountable not doing it. So each part of the process, the parties have a very important role to play, both in contributing data, but also getting it, using it, and then using it as evidence when they need it. And the second question was about different communities that are left out. I mentioned one example earlier about how voter registration rates for men and women are different. One thing that I know in some countries civil society groups have pushed for to include information about a person's disability on the voters list, for example, so that it's a way that if a disabled person's organization or the election commission could look at that data and analyze it, they would be able to better allocate and make sure that the polling stations that have certain types of disability voters would be equipped to provide the accessibility to those voters. So that's one example. Then you have ethnic minorities that might be in certain pockets of a country So if you have data about exactly where they are, where they're registered, where they actually are going to be voting, then the Election Commission, civil society can target their voter education in a more effective way in that language of the ethnic minority, and make sure that if they have, for example, different ballots that have different languages, they can provide it in the right way. And then so voter education, voter information can be targeted more effectively with open election data. And then, I'll stop there. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Michael, for your kind explanation. This is a very great initiative, open election data, and hopefully we can continue the discussion. And we are looking forward to have your program here in Indonesia. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.